All right, thank you everyone for coming. I'm Rick Herman. I'm the interim director here at Mershon this year. I'm really happy to welcome my colleague from the law school, Daniel Chow. Daniel is the Frank E. and Virginia H. Bazler Chair in Business Law at the Moritz College. He served as a law clerk to the Honorable Constance Baker Motley, Chief Judge of the Southern District of New York. He's a graduate of Yale Law School. He's been at Ohio State for a while, almost 30 years. He teaches international law, international transactions, jurisprudence, Asian law, and property. He was featured some time ago on CBS 60 Minutes on the world's greatest fakes. I was just talking with him. Last time he was here to talk, he was part of a U.S.-Chinese commission to look at intellectual property rights in China. He's been a major player in looking at whether China is socializing and become more like the rest of the world in terms of the way it applies law at the international level, or actually is just changing those to its own advantage. So it's a great pleasure to have him here today to talk about why China established the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank. So Daniel, it's great to have you at Mershon. Thank
you. Well, thank you all for coming. So my topic today is why China established the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. This is a topic that's been in the news recently for those of you who've been following international financial issues. So I'll begin by stating that the AAIB, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, officially opened its doors for business on January 16th of this year, January 16, 2016. And at this meeting, all of the great economic powers of the world were there, including Britain, Germany, France, Russia, Italy, Australia, South Korea, among 57 total members. These countries, many of them close allies of the United States, joined the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, even though the United States lobbied them not to join and really asked them to diminish the bank, to ignore the bank, to shun it, to diminish its stature and its role in international finance. But nevertheless, they did join, but the United States did not. And the United States and Japan were left on the outside, with China really running this new bank. And I'm going to talk today about how the AAIB could represent what is the first step in what could be a shift in economic power, power over who writes the rules for international trade, and let me just be clear that the United States has written the rules for international trade for the past at least 50 years, maybe 70 years after the Second World War. And the AAIB may be the first step in a shift from the United States to China, China, who may wind up being the entity that writes the rules for international trade in the 21st century. Now, the United States dominates the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. These are the two Bretton Woods Agreement institutions that are so essential to international or multilateral financing. And I'll be talking about this in some detail. So let me talk about what the World Bank and what the IMF does and how the AAIB can be considered to be a rival to the World Bank and to the IMF. The World Bank and the IMF were established at the end of the Second World War. The United States and some of its close allies convened a conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and hence the term the Bretton Woods Institutions, to create the post-war financial structure that would prevent the disastrous economic policies that contributed to the Second World War. And the Bretton Woods Conference envisaged a tripartite structure, a three-part structure, consisting first of something called the International Trade Organization, which would help to reduce tariffs, which are taxes imposed upon imports at the border, right? Taxes or duties imposed upon imports, in order to facilitate international trade. Now, tariffs were at a historical high right before the Second World War. As nations retreated inward and erected protectionist barriers that had the purpose of preventing international trade. The United States in 1930 passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which imposed a tariff which averaged 53% of the value of the goods imported. Now, a 53% tariff means that a good that cost $1 would be hit with a tax of 53 cents. And that is a draconian tariff, and the purpose and the effect of that tariff is to prevent trade, which is what nations wanted in the period before the Second World War. The ITO was designed to administer something called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, 1947. And the purpose of the GATT was to help reduce tariffs. And the GATT actually was created in 1947, but the ITO itself never came into existence, due mainly to the opposition by the U.S. Congress. And its role was ultimately fulfilled by the World Trade Organization when it came into existence in 1995. So in some ways you can view the WTO as the successor to, or fulfilling the role originally intended for the ITO, although the WTO does many more things beyond what was envisioned for the ITO. Now, there are two other institutions that came out of the Bretton Woods Agreement which did come into existence, and the first was the World Bank. And the purpose of the World Bank was to lend money to Europe for the reconstruction of that continent, which had been devastated by the Second World War. And in addition, to lend money to developing countries to alleviate poverty, which was extreme, and then to also foster economic development in the form of infrastructure projects and other forms of investment projects that would help promote and develop their economies. The International Monetary Fund was set up to ensure stability in the flow of currencies or money across national borders, and to encourage the free exchangeability of currencies, and also to discourage the vicious cycle of devaluations which had occurred before the Second World War. If a country devalues its currency, of course its goods become cheaper for exports, but when it devalues its currency, which is being held by another country, that takes money from that other country. If I devalue a currency by 50% and you're holding my currency, you've just lost 50% of your money. And that was what was going on in the period right before the Second World War. So the IMF was created to deal with this issue, to help countries avoid these vicious devaluations by lending them money so that they can make their payments, their balance of payments problems, and not have to resort to these drastic measures. Together, these three global institutions were to help global trade, because trade cannot really be global if some nations are too poor to trade, or if money cannot be cross national boundaries with predictability, and if they can't be made on time. Both the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund play a major role in the in assistance, especially to developing countries in all parts of the world. But the World Bank and the IMF are dominated by the United States, some Western allies, and Japan. For example, the United States is the largest contributor. The technical term is subscriber, but the being a subscriber means you're contributing funds to the World Bank and the IMF, and your voting power is in proportion to your contributions. So the United States currently has a 16.21 voting share in the World Bank, giving it veto power, and a 16.7 voting share in the International Monetary Fund, which is by far the largest in both institutions. Now look at China by contrast. China has a 4.78% voting share in the World Bank and a 3.81 voting share in the IMF. Now recent efforts were made to increase China's voting power in the IMF, but these efforts were then blocked by the U.S. Congress. Another indication of the dominance of the United States in the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund is that at one time, both institutions were housed in the same building in Washington, D.C. Today, they're housed in buildings on the opposite side of the same street in Washington, D.C. By tradition, the president of the World Bank is an American. Currently, the president is Jim Young Kim, the former president of Dartmouth College, former Harvard Medical School professor. He's the president of the World Bank. And the chief, or the managing director of the International Monetary Fund, by tradition, is a European, currently Christine Lagarde, formerly French Minister of Finance. And for more than 70 years, the World Bank and the IMF have continued this gentleman's agreement in having an American as the president of the World Bank and a European as the chief of the IMF. Now, I need to also mention the Asian Development Bank, the ADB, an affiliate of the World Bank, intended to lend money specifically to countries in Asia, which has its headquarters in Manila, in the Philippines. The ADB is dominated by Japan, and by tradition, the president of the ADB is Japanese. Japan has a 12.8% voting share in the ADB. The United States has a 12.75% voting share. Together, they dominate the ADB, and by contrast, China has a 5.4% voting share in the ADB. So what does China see from this situation? It knows that it is unrealistic to expect that it's ever going to get any real power in the World Bank, in the IMF, or in the Asian Development Bank. The United States is not going to cede power to China because countries in general find it difficult to cede power, right? And another development showing the attitude of the United States is that the United States has excluded China from negotiations for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And this is a free trade agreement that's going to cover most trade in Asia, including Australia. And China is not part of that and has been excluded from those negotiations by the United States, hardly a friendly act. And China perceives that it's been given shoddy treatment by the United States again and again. And rather than fight a battle for power in the World Bank, in the IMF, in the ADB, a fight that China cannot win, and it knows it cannot win, it decided to establish its own bank, the AAIB, to make development loans to countries in Asia. Now, that's what its Articles of Agreement mention, countries in Asia. But I don't think it's necessarily limited to countries in Asia. And I think the AAIB may in the future make loans to developing countries or other countries anywhere in the world. The United States, when China announced the establishment of the AAIB, the United States immediately saw it as an unwanted competitor to the World Bank and the IMF. And the United States then immediately attempted to dissuade its allies from joining the AIIB in order to isolate it and to diminish the stature of this new bank. The argument made by the United States was that the AIIB would not follow best practices in international lending, such as connecting the loans to environmental sustainability, connecting the loans to respect for workers' rights, connecting the loans to non-corruption in government and to transparency in government. the United States argued that China would use the AIIB to make loans which are subject to few conditions, or maybe even no conditions, returning the world to the darkest days of international finance. But despite these entreaties, starting with Britain, the United States' closest ally, all of the allies of the United States decided to join the AIIB, except for Japan, okay? Except for Japan, despite U.S. lobbying. And this was viewed then as a diplomatic disaster and a political embarrassment for the United States. If you looked at the news since January 16th, I'm sure you've seen the hand wringing in Washington over the establishment of the AIIB without U.S. and Japanese participation. Well, China was delighted by the U.S. failure. And Xinhua, which is China's state-controlled media, gloated on its website. Welcome Germany, welcome France, welcome Italy. And said to the United States, don't be peevish, don't be cynical. You're only holding sour grapes. And finished its announcement with a derisive jab. So Washington, what are you waiting for? Well, what are China's concerns about the World Bank and the IMF beyond their domination by the United States? I want to go into this in a little bit further detail. China's concern is that the World Bank and the IMF also, they make loans based upon a set of stringent conditions called the Washington Consensus. These loans come with strings attached. And the strings are that the recipients of the loans must implement policies that are designed, for example, to instill fiscal discipline, not too much government spending, redirection of public spending towards areas such as education, health, and infrastructure, tax reform, broadening the tax base, cutting tax rates. I won't go through the whole list. You can see it on the board. I'll mention a few other ones. Competitive exchange rates based upon the market. Exchange rates in China are not based upon the market. China pegs its exchange rate to the U.S. dollar, right? And China would have to, in complying with this particular condition, change the way that it currently values its currency, which it's not going to do. Privatization of state-owned enterprises. Well, China has the most powerful state-owned enterprises in the world, and state-owned enterprises are critical to China's economy. Legal security for property rights, including intellectual property, despite claims to the contrary. I don't think China has made real progress in the protection of intellectual property, at least not according to multinational companies, which still claim that there are very serious problems. In addition to these values, the World Bank also promotes environmental protection, workers' rights, non-corruption in government, transparency in government. In short, the World Bank and the IMF, through the Washington Consensus, is seeking to impose the conditions of Western capitalism on the recipient of loans, mostly developing countries. Now, I didn't make this up. This is not my own view. This is a criticism of the Washington Consensus, which is fairly well known and fairly common. It's the conditionality of the loans made by the World Bank and the IMF that trouble many critics of the World Bank and the IMF. The institutions are viewed as imposing conditions on countries as a cost of doing business in international trade. In fact, the World Bank and the IMF have policies that are so intrusive that they are seen as dictating structural changes in countries' fiscal and monetary policies, which include banking regulations, government deficit, pension policies. This is not my own criticism. This is a criticism by Joseph Stiglitz, former chief economist for the World Bank and former winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics. So for 50 years, the policies of the World Bank, which have been indistinguishable from the IMF, have both implemented the Washington Consensus, despite resentment from many developing countries which feel humiliated and bullied by being forced to accept these conditions or foregoing the money. So China, in addition to the domination of the World Bank and the IMF by the United States, has long objected to the conditionality of these loans and the intrusive nature in which the World Bank and the IMF operate. China is concerned that the Washington Consensus will foster an international trade framework that will connect issues of the environment, workers' rights, which are quite closely related to human rights, non-corruption in government, transparency, and all the other values of the Washington Consensus that will link these issues to international trade and make them the cost of doing business in international trade. This is inconsistent with China's own view, which is the doctrine of non-interference, to be contrasted with the doctrine of conditionality. China believes that every country has the right to conduct its own internal affairs, free from outside interference, and rejects the idea that some countries, such as the United States, should be able to impose conditions on other countries as a price of doing international business. Now, in particular, China objects to several aspects of the Washington Consensus. On environmental issues, for example, China continues to use coal-fired power plants, which, although a cheap source of energy, is also considered to be dirty fuel that causes serious damage to the environment. It's not that China doesn't care about the environment. China has made environmental protection a national priority. China just doesn't want to be told how to conduct its environmental policies by the United States. The AIIB has already approved a loan, and this is since January, middle of January, a $1 billion loan to Indonesia to finance its coal-fired power plants. This was a project that was rejected by the World Bank for its harmful effects on the economy. And India is hoping for AIIB approval for its power plants fueled by coal because it has a surplus of coal in that country. On workers' rights and human rights issues, workers' rights and human rights are closely related, China's policy of interference, of non-interference as opposed to conditionality, is actually really crucial because China has many areas of contested sovereignty involving tens of millions of people. There's Tibet, also known as Xizang province. There's Xinjiang province, which is the home to the Uyghurs, an ethnic minority of Turkish origin and Muslim faith. And there's a separatist movement, if you want, an independence movement on the part of the Uyghurs. China treats this movement as a terrorist movement, treats attacks by the Uyghurs on ethnic the Han majority Chinese as terrorist attacks. And perhaps most important of all, there's the issue of the sovereignty over Taiwan. China maintains that it has the right to use force, if necessary, to reunite Taiwan with the mainland, and that under the principle of non-interference, no country, including the United States, has any right to say anything about it. And for those of you, unless you've really lived in China and Taiwan, you don't really, I think many people don't really understand the depth of the pain that still exists in China's leadership over the Taiwan issue, because it's a reminder of the long period of weakness that China experienced from the mid-1800s really until the middle of the 20th century, when it had to cede sovereignty over many areas to foreign domination by Western countries. And Taiwan is the last remainder of that, because Taiwan, quite honestly, probably wouldn't exist if the United States had not intervened in the Korean War and had not made promises to protect Taiwan from an invasion by China. Now, if you follow the United States policy of human rights, that supports the right to self-determination. And the U.S. policy on human rights also supports, allow human rights to act as a shield to the exercise of arbitrary state power upon the individual. So the human rights issue would undermine China's claims of sovereignty over these contested areas, including Taiwan. That's why China objects to the conditionality of the U.S. approach in the World Bank and in the IMF. So what can the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank do? It can serve as a counterweight and a rival to the Washington Consensus. It can serve as a policy tool to promote the Beijing Consensus, a doctrine of non-interference as opposed to the doctrine of conditionality. Well, that can happen only if China really controls the AIIB. Well, all indications are that China will control this bank. First of all, China has contributed 30% of the capital of the AIIB and has a 26.06% of the voting rights and veto power. The president-elect of the AIIB is Jin Lichun, who's China's former finance minister. He appoints the staff of the AIIB, and only the vice president of the AIIB needs approval from the board, the AIIB board of directors. Otherwise, he can appoint whomever he wishes to serve on the management staff, which will conduct the day-to-day operations. The headquarters of the AIIB will be in Beijing. And while the day-to-day management, that is the president, his staff, although the management of the bank will be in Beijing, the directors, and there are 12 directors on the AIIB's governing executive board, they will not be present. They will not be in sight in Beijing. And you contrast this with the World Bank and the IMF, who have directors who work on site in Washington, D.C. I was told by a former legal counsel of the World Bank that the 25 directors of the World Bank meet every single Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday of every week to consider World Bank issues. Well, the directors of the AIIB are going to meet once a quarter. That's once every 3 months. How much say will they really have in the day-to-day operations of the AIIB? I think that these particular factors indicate that China will dominate the AIIB. And moreover, let's be very clear that the AIIB is going to be under the control of the Communist Party, because all leaders of any importance in China, governmental, non-governmental, are party officials. Every important governmental or non-governmental official in China holds two positions, the organizational position and a parallel party position, with the party position always supreme to the parallel position. So the current president of China, Xi Jinping, he's the president of the People's Republic of China. That's a government position. But that's not where his power comes from. He's also the general secretary of the Communist Party, the highest position in the party. He's also the head of the Central Military Commission, the party organ which controls the People's Liberation Army. It's his party positions which give him his power, not his governmental positions. I thought, since we're in a university, that those of you might be interested to know, many of you might be interested to know, that the most important person in the university is not the president. It's the party secretary of the university, which is translated in most cases as the provost, because of the alarm it might cause to American students and officials if they knew the party secretary had the most power in the university. So the party, in other words, in my view, is going to control the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. And it's going to use the AIIB for its policy goals. And what are some of these policy goals? Well, I'm only going to mention three here. First, the AIIB will be used to build alliances with developing countries that are going to support China's non-interference policy. Again, as contrasted with the policy of conditionality, which is favored by the United States. The AIIB will also promote China's own infrastructure industries. These are controlled mostly by state-owned enterprises. And these SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, will provide those infrastructure services to the recipients of those loans. In other words, China is going to lend money to countries to buy infrastructure services from China, from Chinese state-owned enterprises, which, by the way, are facing an excess capacity issue due to overbuilding in China for many years. The third objective that I see that the AIIB will promote is to promote the use of the RMB, the people's currency, as a global currency in order to challenge the supremacy of the US dollar as a global currency. Most international transactions today are in US dollars. And what this gives to the United States is great power over international trade, because all transactions in US dollars, even if initiated overseas, must get clearance through banks in the United States. And so this allows the United States to control international trade and to impose sanctions on a country by simply blocking U.S. banks from releasing U.S. dollars for trade in that country. So, for example, the United States could block all transactions in the sale of oil from Iran by simply prohibiting transfers of U.S. dollars to Iran. And since oil is paid for in U.S. dollars, this effectively blocks most trade in oil to Iran. And that's one of the bases on which the United States imposed trade sanctions on Iran, which are being eased. If the AIIB promotes the RMB as a currency used in international trade, which I think it will, then China will have the same power to impose economic sanctions on trades using the RMB by blocking the transfer of the RMB in trade transactions it doesn't like, with countries it doesn't like. So I've come to my conclusions, and I'll be happy to take questions after my conclusions, and happy to discuss any of those aspects of this talk with you. And my conclusions are these: that the United States dominates the World Bank, the IMF, related institutions like the Asian Development Bank, and have used these institutions for decades to further its own policy goals. Is this surprising? Of course not. States that dominate multilateral institutions use these institutions to further their own policy goals. This should be a surprise to nobody. This is a political reality. Why then should anyone expect China to do anything different with the AIIB? If the United States has used the World Bank and the IMF for decades to promote the Washington Consensus, why wouldn't China use the AIIB to promote the Beijing Consensus? That is, the goals of the state party. To me, this is a foregone conclusion. The only question is, how effective will the AIIB be in promoting these policy goals? Since the AIIB is so new, it remains to be seen. And one of the things that remains to be seen is whether other AIIB members, beginning with Britain, are able or are willing to rein in the control of the AIIB by the party. And in my view, how this unfolds, and this of course is related to other issues of international trade, the use of international trade treaties, which I could discuss separately, which is a separate topic. But this is one part of what's what is unfolding on the international stage, and how this unfolds will determine, in my view, whether the United States or China will write the rules for international trade in the 21st century. So, thank you. Yes, sir.
Can you speak a little bit about the impact of the Pacific Trade Pact that's now before Congress, whether it passes or is rejected? What's the impact going to be vice versa?
Well, I think the purpose of the TPP is to further consolidate and strengthen U.S. dominance in Asia. When you have a free trade agreement, it means that goods that are traded in the free trade agreement come in duty-free. So goods from Vietnam would come in duty-free to the United States under the TPP if it passes, and we're not sure it's going to pass. There's an election year, as you know. There's a lot of talk about international trade, a lot of it very hostile. So we don't know if the TPP will pass. But if it does pass, then goods that come in under the TPP come in